Okay, good evening everyone and welcome to the JCT SPHE webinar, an introduction to junior cycle SPHE. So my name is Ciara Byrne and I work as JCT team leader for SPHE, and together this evening with SPHE advisor Nari Louise Ross, we look forward to taking you through this SPHE webinar. So there'll be a number of interactive polls and questions posed during the course of the next hour, and we really look forward to hearing your responses. You will have an opportunity to play back the webinar with your colleagues in time, as the webinar will be uploaded to our website www.jct.ie, and it will be there under the short courses section. Here you will find all SPHE related materials, including key documents, as well as slides and support materials relating to the CPD workshops offered to the SPHE teachers to date. We invite you as well to follow JCT on Twitter for up-to-date information, and if you have any questions or queries after this webinar ends, please email them into us at info@jct.ie. If you haven't attended a webinar before, this is how your screen would have looked when you logged in. Okay, so this little tab in the right-hand corner will be how you access your toolbar. And this toolbar is where you will find access to the handouts and the questions facility throughout the webinar. Okay, so one of the facilities there is the questions. You can ask questions throughout the webinar. Myself and Nari will address questions at different points, and there is time built in at the end to answer some questions as well. If we can't answer your question this evening, we will keep a list of them and we will email you a follow-up answer in due course. Okay, so with that in mind, let's have a look and see who our audience is tonight. We're going to conduct a poll for us to gain some insight into what JCT SPHE training people have engaged with, and I'm going to hand over to Nari Louise in order to conduct this poll.
Thank you, Ciara, and good evening. My name is Nari Louise Ross. And within our first quick poll, we are asking which JCT SPHE CPD events have you attended to date? The first option is the CPD day, which would be in the form of cluster days within schools. The next option is the short course symposium, which would have been run in Athlone Springs Hotel a number of weekends ago. Thirdly, this elective webinar is my first SPHE CPD event. And finally, I'm not an SPHE teacher, but I have tuned in to hear about developments in this area. We will launch the poll now, and the questions as well as the options should appear on your screen. We're going to give you a few seconds to answer these before we start to get the results of the poll and to share these. Okay, so the responses coming in are that within the SPHE CPD cluster day, 15% of you have attended this CPD cluster day. 0% have attended the short course symposium. 63%, this is my first JCT SPHE CPD within this webinar tonight. And 25% are not an SPHE teacher, but tuned in tonight to hear about developments in this area. And I would say that that's very positive, because if this webinar is your first engagement with SPHE and how that looks, this will be very much an information giving session this evening. So we'll, as Ciara said, be taking your questions throughout the night. So within this webinar, our learning intentions are as follows. We will explore SPHE as part of our school's junior cycle and wellbeing programs, develop our knowledge and understanding of the strands and learning outcomes within the SPHE short course specification, and explore how to plan for teaching, learning, assessment and reporting using the learning outcomes in the SPHE short course specification. Let's now look at the structure of the junior cycle slide, which you would have already seen at a number of training events. As you will already know, students will experience the statements of learning and key skills across their programme through subjects, short courses, other learning experiences and well-being. So, where does SPHE fit within this framework? Well, in answer to that, SPHE falls within the area of well-being, which has been identified as an area of learning schools are required to provide to its students. It can also be offered as a short course. And as SPHE makes up one of the 3 curricular areas of well-being, let's have a closer look at the provision of SPHE within the well-being programme. SPHE in your well-being programme. Students must study social, personal and health education. The Circular 79/2018 states that schools must provide a minimum provision of 70 hours for SPHE across first, second and third year. The options for study are set out in the 2017 NCCA Junior Cycle Wellbeing Guidelines as follows. The specification for the Junior Cycle Short Course in SPHE 2016 and the Junior Cycle Syllabus in SPHE 2000. Okay, so now we're going to conduct a quick poll to find out what your school is currently providing in terms of SPHE provision, and I'm going to hand over to Kira for the results of this poll.
Okay, thanks Nari. So your options here for this poll are going to be, is all students in junior cycle engaging with the short course specification 2016, all students following the 2000 syllabus, or possibly you've switched to the short course but some students are still following the syllabus. So for example, maybe your first years are following the SPHE short course but second and third years are following the syllabus. And the final option will be not sure. So if you're not sure what option your school is currently providing. So I'm going to launch the poll. I'm going to give it about 10-15 seconds to answer, and then we're going to have a look at some of the results. So it should be coming up on your screen about now, and if you could record your answers there. Okay, if we close the poll there and have a look at the results that have come in. So looking at these results, 12% of you, all your students are following the short course. 44%, all your students are following the syllabus. 13% of you have switched the short course for some students, but others are still following the syllabus. And 31% are not sure which option is being provided. That might be a conversation that needs to happen at school level, that you go back and maybe have the conversation around what is actually being provided in our SPHE. So the reason we want to talk about this, so 44% of you are following the syllabus, and that's important because we're going to have a look through how that impacts our provision. So when we talk about the syllabus, it is important that we remember that the syllabus was published in 2000 and it's content-based learning around 10 topics and was not designed in accordance with the framework for junior cycle and not framed under the wellbeing guidelines. And the reason it's important we keep that in mind is because in accordance with the wellbeing guidelines, where schools choose not to include SPHE short course as part of their wellbeing programme, planning for SPHE should be done using an Appendix I. And the Appendix I is a tool for planning within the area of wellbeing, and you will find a link to the wellbeing guidelines in your handout that's attached in your taskbar, and the Appendix I can be found on page 103 and 104 of the wellbeing guidelines. What that means in terms of planning, if we look a little bit at the Appendix I in more detail, you will note that you'll have to consider the following areas if you're planning using the 2000 SPHE syllabus. So you need to be connecting the learning to the 24 statements of learning. You need to be connecting the learning to the 8 key skills, their elements that they contain, and the specific learning activity that they are activated by. You need to be creating your own learning outcomes that must be clearly linked to well-being and use the language of the well-being indicators, and then linking those outcomes to activities students will engage with. And you need to consider your assessment that students will engage with to show evidence of their learning, and consider the resources you have available to you. For those of you following the NCCA short course specification, this was created in tandem with the framework and the wellbeing guidelines, and the elements of both, namely the principles, the statements of learning, the key skills, and the wellbeing indicators, are embedded in the specification's design and the learning outcomes. So as such, if your school is following the short course, you will not need to use the Appendix I for planning. You will simply work directly from the specification where these elements are already present. And as we mentioned before, the NCCA short course was developed in tandem with the wellbeing guidelines, and you will find a comprehensive overview of the wellbeing indicators linked to the short course in SPHE in the back of the wellbeing guidelines. So if you want to explore that further, that document is available to you. So for the rest of this webinar, we're going to be focusing in on the NCCA short course specification, and we're going to explore it under the following headings. So we're going to be looking at the structure of the short course specification, we're going to be looking at the strands and the learning outcomes, and we're going to be using the specification to plan for teaching, learning, assessment and reporting. So with that in mind, from late August 2019, all 21 NCCA designed specifications will be in place for our first years. So you may already know the difference between a syllabus and a specification if you have experience within your subject space already. If not, the main areas to consider are that the specification reflects a continuum of learning with a focus on learner progression. It's written in terms of learning outcomes. It sets out a clear expectation for learning. It provides examples of those expectations for learners. It includes a focus on key skills, and it strives for clarity in language and for consistency in terminology. So as we've already mentioned a few times, the SPHE short course specification was developed in tandem with both the framework for junior cycle and the wellbeing guidelines. It is designed for 100 hours of student engagement. It has learning outcomes covering 4 strands, which we're going to look at in a few moments in closer detail. And it also includes 1 classroom-based assessment, or CBA. So let's have a look at the aims of SPHE as laid out in the short course. SPHE aims to develop students' positive sense of themselves and their physical, social, emotional and spiritual health and well-being. And it aims to build the capacity of young people to develop and maintain healthy relationships. So what you'll see is the focus here is very much student-centred, and we're going to look at how this student-centred approach is represented in the learning outcomes and the learning offered to students through the course. So the course is organised into 4 strands. Strand 1, who am I? This focuses on developing self-awareness and building self-esteem. Strand 2, minding myself and others, provides opportunities for students to reflect on how they can best take care of themselves and others. Strand 3, team up, focuses on student learning about important relationships in their lives and building relationship skills. And Strand 4, My Mental Health, focuses on building positive mental health, examining young people's experience of mental health, ill health, and learning how to support themselves and others in challenging times. So, as you can already be aware of, the learning outcomes in junior cycle specification are very much focused on student learning. In our SPHE classes, the learning outcomes will provide an excellent starting point for developing students' social, personal, and health awareness and understanding. So the learning outcomes set out for students what they should know, understand, and be able to do as a result of the learning and teaching activities they have undertaken. There are 45 learning outcomes across the 4 strands in SPHE short course, and the outcomes are numbered to support teacher planning, but this does not suggest any form of hierarchy or importance across the outcomes. It's just to help us when we are planning. So you will see here the learning outcomes and how they're organised across the 4 strands. And this learning outcomes poster is actually available to you in your taskbar as a handout if you want to download a copy and keep it for your future planning. And it will be available shortly on the JCT website. And at this point, we'd like to engage with you a little bit to find out how you might experience using these learning outcomes through teaching. And we're going to ask you to do this by engaging with a Menti. So if you would go to menti.com and use the code posted above, 801458, and we're going to ask you to maybe put in a couple words or questions here about what opportunities do you see for teachers engaging with these learning outcomes. What opportunities do you as a teacher see with engaging with these learning outcomes? And I will open up the Menti and you can see some of the results coming in. So no results have come in as of yet. Okay, we've got one person here. So someone's saying that by engaging with these outcomes, they see more flexibility, mental health, resilience and coping methods. Okay, cross-linear support. Okay, mental health and engagement and support coming in as some of the major areas that people see the opportunities in dealing with. Student voice has also been mentioned a few times there. Support, engagement, awareness, student well-being, student voice. These are really good to see. Greater collaboration. Interesting to see that teachers are seeing that engaging with these outcomes brings a more collaborative approach or more collaboration. Promoting positive mental health, increased engagement, engage learners in resilience, direction, toughness, awareness. A lot of different things coming in here, but all along the same strand, it seems to be a lot of stuff about responsibility, about student-centered, resilience, mental health, and student voice. Anything you want to comment on there, Nari?
Yeah, thanks, Ciara. The student voice I can see is coming across quite strongly here, and we'll mention that again and the opportunity for that, particularly within the SPHE classroom. Obviously, mental health being front and centre of a lot of our minds at the moment in the world that we live in, and a very valuable thing to cover with young people in the SPHE classroom as well as resilience. It's probably coming up time and again in schools that teachers wish to teach young people about their resilience and how that is working for them in their junior cycle years. That engagement, as well as Ciara mentioned, this opportunity for collaboration within the SPHE short course, and also leading to that heightened engagement, I think, with students when they're collaborating, when they're being held responsible, when they're empowered, given that independence in the class for more self-directed learning. I'm just having a look to see was there any other interesting things coming up the resilience again, the teamwork, the language of well-being. That's an interesting one. We'll get more into that. So I'm glad that somebody pointed that out, because we'll talk about the indicators of well-being and their place within SPHE. So Ciara, I think we're good to keep going there, and I'm going to just take the next few. So actually, Ciara, I'm going to hand it back over to you at this point.
Okay, thank you for engaging with that. And we'll get the screen back up for you now. Oh, no, we've lost our screen. Sorry, we'll get just back online now. The screen is gone. There we go. Okay, sorry. Back on the line with this. So thank you very much for engaging with that. And what you might have noticed, if we look more closely here, I'm going to focus in on learning outcomes 2.1 to 2.4. And you might notice as you engage with those learning outcomes that each of them starts with an action verb. And the action verb there is to support planning for teaching, learning and assessment. So they let us as the teacher know what skills or actions students will have to be able to demonstrate in order to fulfill the learning outcome. And if we take learning outcome 2.1 as our example here, so students will need to not only know or discuss how diet, physical activity, sleep, rest and hygiene contribute to self-confidence, self-esteem and well-being, but look at examples and evaluate them for themselves and put that learning into action. So the evaluate there is the key part of that. And those learning outcomes are from Strand 2, Minding Myself and Others. So we mentioned previously there, very shortly, that as mentioned, there is a CBA as part of this SPHE short course. The classroom-based assessment includes an SPHE project and an individual reflection. It is completed in 2nd or 3rd year, and the project can be based on any topic related to the course and should draw upon learning from at least 2 strands of the SPHE short course. And by drawing on the learning in at least 2 strands, students can make important connections between the different aspects of their personal, social and health well-being. So further details relating to the CBA and examples of SPHE projects and individual reflection templates can actually be found in the back of the SPHE assessment guidelines. And you will find a link to the assessment guidelines in the handout attached to your taskbar. And further support for the SPHE CBA will be given in future JCT CPD events. Okay, if they have engaged with that CBA, students' achievement can be profiled on the JCPA under the short course section, as you will see above. And it's also worth noting that in accordance with the new circular 79/2018, from 2020, the JCPA will include a specific area where student achievement in the wellbeing subjects will be profiled. So before we look any closer at planning, we're just going to do a check-in here about, do you have any questions about the short course specification in SPHE in junior cycle? And we're going to take a moment to address some of the questions that have been coming through over the last couple of minutes. So Nari, I'm going to hand over to you to address some of the questions that have been coming through.
Thanks, Ciara. As Ciara mentioned, before we look at planning using the specification, we want to answer 1 or 2 questions. And I'm just watching to see what questions are coming up strongly as such, what trends are coming up in terms of questions. And the first one is, if we undertake the short course, when will we have to introduce CBAs? Or will we always be able to do the short course without having the CBA? The answer to that is that you cannot follow the short course, which includes the full 100-hour engagement, without the CBA. However, if you have 70 hours of curricular time allocated to SPHE, and you are choosing to use the learning outcomes from the specification to plan for teaching and learning within SPHE, you will not undertake the CBA in an official capacity, and it cannot be reported on as you haven't gone deep enough into the learning. Another question coming up there is, if my school only has 70 hours of SPHE, can we take the short course? In answer to that, the short course is designed for 100 hours, and in order for it to be classified as a short course, your school needs to have 100 hours available for it. However, you can choose to use the learning outcomes from the short course specification to plan for teaching and learning in SPHE for 70 hours of timetable engagement, but it is not classed as a short course, and achievement in the CBA cannot be profiled on the JCPA as such. If you're using the learning outcomes to plan for 70 hours of engagement, we suggest the following things. Schools can incorporate shorter units based on the learning outcomes selected from NCCA short course in SPHE. Include learning outcomes from the 4 strands. Be guided by local context and student interests and needs. Consider current good practice in teaching, learning, assessment and reporting in SPHE, and choose a meaningful and manageable means of assessment. And I'm just going to take one more question there, which is coming up. If we don't do the short course, can SPHE be put on the JCPA? Good question. The answer to that is that if achievement in SPHE cannot be profiled on the short courses section of the JCPA, but participation in both syllabus and specification can be profiled in other areas of learning. Now, as expressed by Kira earlier, we probably haven't gotten to all of your questions right now, but there will be space later on to answer some of the other pertinent questions that are coming up, and we will endeavour to get to all of your questions by the end of the webinar or afterwards via email. So thank you very much for those, and I hope that you continue to throw us out the questions. So we're going to move on now and look at planning in SPHE using the short course specification, and we'll have time later to address more questions, as I say. So looking at the framework for junior cycle in creating a unit of learning, teachers will use the learning outcomes provided by subject or short course specifications as a starting point for planning a unit of learning, and to develop learning intentions and success criteria to be shared and discussed with their students. There are currently 2 templates available on jct.ie for planning units of learning within SPHE. You will find the links to both of them in the handout that we have attached to the taskbar that we mentioned at the start of the webinar. But for the example that we're going to work through now, we will be using the template on the left. These templates are only suggestions to get you started on your planning journey. However, they both cover all of the key elements required for planning within junior cycle. So in building our unit of learning, we started by considering some key questions to guide our planning. What learning outcomes would work well together and why? So we work across the strands thinking what learning outcomes are going to work well together. Are these suited to the age and stage of our students? How do we know? And what prior knowledge or experience might students have? What is the key learning for students in these outcomes? What do you want students to learn? How will we know what students have learned? Where is the evidence? What learning experiences could support student learning? And what resources do we have or could we access? So when selecting our learning outcomes, we consider the following. Which outcomes would work well together and why? The age and stage of the students we are planning for. And finally, in order to ensure meaningful learning experiences for students, we looked at where we could make connections between the strands. Certainly, this can be done very much in consultation with students in your class in terms of where their interests and needs lie. This works well in an SPHE classroom where there can be ample opportunity for student voice to flourish. With that in mind, Kira and I planned for a first year class at this point of the year with the focus on healthy eating. You can see those details in the top boxes, and we envisage that this learning would take place over a 5-week period. In order to plan for meaningful and connected learning, we looked for links across the strands and decided to link the learning on food and healthy eating with goal setting and source reliable information. These learning outcomes are from strand 1, who am I? And the learning outcomes within that strand are 1.5, identify short, medium and long-term personal goals and ways in which they might be achieved, and 1.7, source appropriate and reliable information about health and well-being. And from strand 2, minding myself and others, the learning outcomes we chose are 2.1, evaluate how diet, physical activity, sleep, rest and hygiene contribute to self-confidence, self-esteem and well-being. And 2.2, critique the impact of the media, advertising and other influences on one's decisions about health and well-being. And as learning outcomes set out what students will be able to do by the end of 3 years, as you can see from the yellow boxes here, we are focusing on specific aspects of the learning outcomes for this particular unit, with the view to revisiting them in different ways in further units of learning as time goes on. Once we have laid out what learning we want to occur, we need to think about what students will be able to say, make, write or do in order to demonstrate their learning. Assessment is evidence of learning, and we keep the learning outcomes in mind while designing modes of assessment. So within this particular unit of learning, the assessment is that students will demonstrate their learning when they place samples of household food items on the different levels of the food pyramid, discuss and debate with their classmates the reason for their choices, evaluate different examples of meals and make suggestions as to how they can be made healthier, create a food diary for a week and use this to set a goal for one change they can make. On that note, we'd like to hear your suggestions. So looking at the 3 examples of possible assessment here, we would like to hear your input. So in the question box, you can give any suggestions for how you would assess this learning, or any assessment strategies you think would be relevant to this learning. So I'll just give you a little bit of time to do that, and we'll get samples from our participants. Okay, so different examples that are coming in here. Possibilities are survey a year group about their food choices and create a poster campaign for the school. I use the data to create visual displays about food choices in the school. Watch a documentary. Evaluate the information and write a review. Have a cook-off for students. That's an interesting one, actually. Have a cook-off for students, which might be cross-curricular with, for example, home economics. Do a lunchbox challenge. Maybe taking in documentaries such as Operation Transformation. Design a menu for a health camp. Set up a think, pair, share with a level of engagement with discussion, and go on from there to do project work. Design a menu for the school canteen.
That's an interesting one that could be linked to that prior suggestion there of surveying a year group or a class group. There's a lot of opportunities for engagement there, and that people could survey people and then design for their own school canteens and their context. That's a really nice example. That's also linked to the next two examples there. There's people suggesting maybe a poster campaign on our class eating habits, and a poster design or student reflection, or design a recipe book of healthy eating. They're all really, really nice and really active examples of how we can gather evidence on student learning and assessment.
Thanks everybody for those suggestions. It just shows the power of being able to collaborate and pool ideas when planning together in units of learning. And then once we have decided on the assessment checks we will use for the learning, we considered how students might experience the learning in class, in questioning what learning experiences will they have in the lead up to assessment points. In this case, students are creating a class food pyramid out of labels and photos they have collected at home or in school. They've created a project surveying and evaluating the class and year groups' choices around food, creating a chart or display to show their findings and present them to their class. Select a documentary on the food industry or healthy eating, watching the documentary and filling out a reflection sheet about what they have learned from it. Look at magazine, TV, social media advertisements to do with food, weight, and evaluate the message these ads are sending, considering consequences of how these ads may make people feel, and create a recipe booklet as a class for healthy meals based on recommended guidelines, the food pyramid, etc. Finally, we considered how the learning outcomes connected to the key skills and the well-being indicators. There were many elements of the key skills that we could have made links to, but we only included the ones with the clearest links to this unit of learning. So in this case, the focus would be on the element of discussing and debating within the key skill of communicating, being healthy and physically active within the key skill of staying well, making considered decisions and setting and achieving personal goals within managing myself, and the element of implementing ideas and taking action within the key skill of being creative. In the case of descriptors within the wellbeing indicators, the ones that we felt are the most relevant here are: am I aware of what my personal values are, and do I think through my decisions within the indicator of aware? Do I feel that I am listened to and valued within respect? And do I make healthy eating choices within responsible? Now that we have gone through the process of planning for SPHE, we're going to take questions in a moment about your planning. You will notice that the last box on this template that is not filled in is a post-unit reflection. This should be considered while you are teaching the unit and when you have finished, in asking yourself what has worked well for your students, what areas need support, what are the next steps, how might I do it differently next time, even better if. So I'm going to hand over to Kira, and we're going to take this opportunity to address one or two questions regarding the planning that have come in while we were talking through the planning process.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Nari, and thank you for bringing us through that. So a couple questions that have come in, and please do type in any questions you have around the planning process as we're going through this. I'm going to have a look here. There's one come in, or quite a few questions come in here about how long a unit of learning should be. In the most general sense, we're saying roughly between 5 and 7 weeks, but there is no specific or determined time frame. Okay, and it may be that you plan roughly 7 units of learning throughout the year, or as many as is needed to suit the context of your school and your students' needs. Okay, so a unit is just for planning for a unit of time, and in planning this way, it's more collaborative and you can work together on those units as you need them, and you can build on the prior learning. Okay, there's one coming in here around when do we need to start planning in this way? Okay, that's a really good question. I would suggest that maybe you sit down with your department and begin planning collaboratively in short periods of time, so say from Easter to the end of the year if you're working with the specification, and with whatever students are engaging in with the short course, and this way you'll have ready to plan this way going forward, and it's best practice to start planning this way going forward. Are the units of learning planning specifically for the short course? If I'm following it informally, do I need to plan this way? So I'm assuming what you're talking about is informally there is if you're planning using the 70 hours, if you're following it using the learning outcomes. I would suggest there that yes, you should be, if you're engaging with the learning outcomes as part of your provision for SPHE, that you would be planning this way, as this makes all of the connections that you need, and it's a good way of planning collaboratively within departments. Okay. In planning, do all learning outcomes need to be covered at some stage across the 3 years, or just outcomes that are relevant to your students? Okay, that's a very, very good question. We would strongly encourage, if you're covering it as the 100-hour short course, then yes, all learning outcomes need to be covered at some stage across the 3 years. But going back to what we said earlier, if you're covering it in 70 hours and you're mapping those learning outcomes onto the 70 hours, you're planning for shorter units of learning that incorporate as much of those learning outcomes as possible, but are guided by the context of your school and the needs of your students. Okay. A lot of questions coming in around, is this planning enough for inspection, WSE, or must lesson plans be included? I can't speak to personal lesson plans, and that's the way your school organises your planning, but in terms of quality planning for SPHE, this is something that is being considered as part of inspections and something that will need to be looked after. So there needs to be quality planning happening in the area of SPHE in your schools. Okay, I'm going to leave it there for questions for planning at the minute. There will be more space for questions in a moment, and I'm going to move on from there and look at developing our practice into the future. So what do we need to think about going forward? And we have some suggestions here for how to develop your practice going into the future. Okay, so you have the flexibility and potential to build on your current practice. Okay, so there is practices and planning practices already in place in your school. We're asking you to consider what is currently working well for you and to build on that practice going forward. Okay, familiarise yourself with the specification and assessment guidelines. If your school is following the short course specification, make sure that all teachers are aware. So going back to that poll we did earlier, where some of you weren't actually sure which provision was actually being followed in your school, that's a conversation to have. Familiar yourself with whatever option your school is going with, and if it is the specification, familiarise yourself with the 4 strands and the learning outcomes and your assessment guidelines. Collaborate to develop student-centred units of learning, and this could be said for both the short course and the syllabus. Okay, so collaborating with your colleagues to build student-centred units of learning or planning for student-centred learning. It makes for a better and more enriching experience for students, and it's a good professional development for ourselves. Adapt to school context and student needs. This is really, really important. I see questions coming up there earlier about following particular books, or is this particular book okay to follow? I would always say that it's an interpretation of one person's interpretation of the syllabus or one person's interpretation of the learning outcomes, but you need to adapt to your own school's context, and more importantly, you need to be adapting to your students' needs. What are their needs and interests, and are they being met by the curriculum we are putting on for them? And offer meaningful and authentic learning and assessment experiences. Most importantly, all of this, it is student-centred, and we need to make sure that our students are at the centre. And this goes back to what Nari was talking about earlier with student voice. Are we offering our students a voice or a space to have their voice heard within our SPHE classrooms? And are they getting a meaningful and authentic engagement with the SPHE syllabus? Okay, further information. If you need further information or guidance, okay, if you're looking for either the SPHE short course specification or the assessment guidelines, you will find them on curriculumonline.ie. If you are looking for any of the JCT offered supports, you will find them on the short courses landing page, which there is a link to in your handout. And if you need any further questions answered, you can go to info@jct.ie. I'm noticing here a little bit of lag in the screens changing for our attendees. So I will leave this information up for a second before moving on, so that when it comes up, you will be able to see all of the links. Okay, for the last 10 minutes, we are going to be answering as many of the questions as we possibly can that have come through over the course of the short course. So again, if there's something we haven't addressed while throughout this webinar, please feel free to put it into the question box, and we will be answering them now. So Nara, if you want to take the first question there, and we'll swap over and back between the two of us.
Perfect, thanks Ciara. A strong question coming in there is, what format does the reflective journal or personal learning diary for students in SPHE short course need to take? Very pertinent question at the moment. The answer to that is that it is a school choice regarding this format, and we would quote the specification on CPD cluster days in relation to that. That is to say that the nature of much of students learning in SPHE is concerned with attitudes, values and feelings, and is personal to the student. And students should be encouraged to keep a personal learning diary for the duration of the short course, where they can reflect privately on their learning in SPHE. And with the agreement of the student, some of the entries may be used to support different learning activities, but essentially the personal learning diary is private and for the student only. And I would direct people's attention to the name of the personal learning diary, which relates to the learning within SPHE and the structure that you can create within that, so that it might be that the diary part is knitted into the end of the SPHE lesson, and that it is quite structured in order to create a safe boundary within the SPHE classroom, and also to talk to students ahead of ever creating these entries around an SPHE contract within the class, in order to talk about confidentiality and how that needs to be taken further within the structures, the care structures of the school, if needs be, so that students and indeed parents are quite aware of that. So thank you for that interesting question on the personal learning diary. The next one that's coming in there is there any guide on how many Appendix I's you need to fill out if you're following the old syllabus? Is it one per term or is it one per year group? And the answer to that is that Appendix I refers to a unit of learning within the case of the SPHE short course, or pardon me, the SPHE syllabus, which is usually about 4 weeks in length. That's a suggestion, and you can adapt this to your school situation, and it would need to be an Appendix I per unit, so you would need a few per term depending on what you would like to cover within that Appendix I. Kira, would you like to take the next couple of questions there?
Yeah, there's a couple of interesting questions coming in here. There's one here regarding, to follow on from what Nari was saying about the Appendix I, at what point in time or what year will they have to move to the short course and therefore get rid of your Appendix I and start planning with the strands? The current circular, so Circular 79/2018, encourages schools to consider the short course specification. So it says schools should consider the NCCA design courses when developing their wellbeing program. However, currently there is no marked date for when schools would have to make a change. So just make sure that you are keeping up with your planning in accordance with that, and considering the short courses in your planning for wellbeing. There's one coming in here around, can we tell more about the nature or the content of the CBAs and whether it's imperative or whether we have to undertake it? The CBA, and you'll find more details of this in the assessment guidelines, and again, they are linked in the handout that is attached to this webinar. The CBA is a pair or small group work project and a personal reflection, and it's based around any topic relating to SPHE. It is imperative, so they must do it for the profiling of achievement of a 100-hour short course. Okay, so outside of this, if, for example, you're only providing 70 hours for SPHE and you're following and you're planning for learning using the learning outcomes, it is not imperative, but we would say that it is best practice. Okay, so there's nothing stopping you from using the CBA within that, but it cannot be considered for profiling on the JCPA because it's not classified as a short course. Again, professional time coming in here. When are we supposed to do all of this? When will we get time to plan collaboratively? There is now paid professional time for teachers, so you will have one 40-minute period free per week, and this time can be bundled throughout the year to carry out your LARs or your SLAR, and you can decide as an SPHE department when you will meet, and if you cannot find the time, you could consider maybe digital forms of communication or other online tools. And as such, your professional time is a school-based decision and a localised decision, but it is there for you to use in these sorts of cases and to use for your planning. Nari has a question coming through here that she's going to address.
Thank you. I wanted to get to a question there that's prevalent at the moment. Is it a problem to start your 70 hours in second year being aware that you won't get finished by third year? And the answer to that would be that SPHE must be taught over the 3 years of junior cycle. So that 70 hours must be spread out over first, second and third year. And that is explicit in the current circular 79/2018. Another question that's coming in is there a limit to the number of short courses that schools do? I know that you have to do 2 at least if choosing to do short courses. Thanks. Okay, so the number of short courses that schools can currently do is a maximum of 4. So let's say you have 8 subjects, then you can do a maximum of 4 short courses. However, this year, as outlined in the circular 79/2018 as well, from this September onwards, if a school is doing 8 subjects and 4 short courses, they can also do the wellbeing short courses. Now, what I mean by the wellbeing short courses are the SPHE, CSPE and PE short courses. This will be catered for in the wellbeing section of the JCPA reported from 2020. So hopefully that answers that. Ciara, were there more coming up there?
Yes. Can students be removed from SPHE class for resource? Okay, SPHE is compulsory for all students. Okay, so all students should be engaging with SPHE. There's also a really interesting question coming in here about, is there an SPHE qualification? Okay, there are no currently undergraduate courses with SPHE, but there are qualifications available postgraduately, and if it's something you have a keen interest in this area, we do encourage you to look into this further, as if you would like to further your studies in SPHE and your engagement with SPHE. With that, okay, I'd like to thank everyone. That's all we really have time for this evening. So thank you so much for joining us and participating in this webinar. I hope you have a really good evening and the best of luck with your SPHE journey, and we look forward to working with you again in the future. And any questions that I didn't get around to asking, we will answer them in a follow-up email. So thank you very, very much.